Hello, this is Professor John Baugh, and today we're going to start our journey into the quick and dirty Java guides. These guides are more or less very simple guides that I put together without a tremendous amount of prep work. They're basically how I would go about teaching classes when I teach during my any of my day job. So hopefully this will be useful to you, and it'll also get you to where you need to be in different areas of Java programming, and hopefully we'll do other languages later on if it turns out that my subscribers like this format. But today we're going to be talking about data types and variables. So data types and variables are really fundamental to the way that Java works. So first of all, we're going to create a project in NetBeans. This is currently NetBeans IDE 8.2. That's the version that I'm using currently. It's the most updated version. If you're watching this in the future, it might be on to IDE 8.3, 8.4, what have you. But it should be fairly similar. And even if you're using a different IDE, like Eclipse or IntelliJ, you should be able to follow along as long as you know how to create basic projects. Because other than that, the code is going to be essentially the same. But we're using NetBeans for a variety of reasons. But I just in general like NetBeans as one of my favorites. I found that I used to use Eclipse all the time, and I found that I actually prefer NetBeans, and there's a couple other features that might help us later on. So let's create a project. If I go to File, New Project, and I'm going to go under Java and just create a basic Java application. And we have to decide, this is the first time I've run it on this particular account, so it might take it a couple seconds. We're going to have to decide on a name for the project, and we're also going to have to put it in a particular location. We can also choose a package name if we'd like to. So I'm going to uncheck Create Main Class. That's one of the first things I do. And then instead of putting it in the default NetBeans projects directory, I actually created a specific folder for this particular instruction called workdir underneath a couple directories on my desktop. So I'm going to put it in there, and I'm going to call this the QND proj1, or you could say test1, or whatever you want to call it, as long as it's a valid name. Then I'm going to hit finish. So that gives me a project in NetBeans. The next step is under source packages. I could put stuff in the default package, or I could come up with a package of my own. Typically, for the beginning instruction that we'll discuss, the default package is sufficient. When you start making larger projects where you'll have a bunch of files, then you want to come up with your own package. But for right now, we'll just use it in default because it's easy. So I'm going to right-click Default Package, go to New Java Class, and we're just going to call this Test Vars for test variables. So this loads with a bunch of JavaDoc and regular comments. I tend to delete those because they kind of just muff up everything. Now I'm going to create the main method, and the main method is the entry point or starting point for where the program will begin. So anytime you launch your application and it runs through the Java virtual machine, it will start with main. So that's just the fundamentals of creating pretty much any project, or the majority of projects that you're going to create. One of the things we want to discuss, or the major thing we want to discuss in this particular lecture, is data types and variables. So whenever you create a variable, what we're talking about is you're creating a named alias for a memory location of some sort. So if I do this, if I say int my int, what I'm doing with that is I'm naming a variable my int. So the data type is int, or integer, and then we say that the identifier is my int. Okay, so the data type determines what kind of data that variable can hold. So backing up a little bit more, there are ultimately two categories of variables, two categories of, or data types rather, two categories of data types. So we've got category 1 are primitive. There are 8 of them in Java. And then the other category are reference types. Anything that's not a primitive. Any data type that's not a primitive is a reference type. Now, the way that they hold the data is somewhat different. This isn't meant to be a very thorough coverage of every possible detail of how the memory management works or how the data types are created in memory or anything, but just to give you an idea, the primitive types, when you create a variable of a primitive type like myInt, since int is one of the 8 primitives, we'll talk about that, it directly holds the value. When I have a reference type, which is not one of the 8 primitives that we'll talk about, a reference type doesn't actually hold the value directly that we're interested in. Instead, it holds a memory address, and you indirectly point to, for lack of a better term, an object that lives in an area of the memory called the heap. Okay, so that's a little bit beyond what we're talking about right now, so we're not going to spend too much time on it. Just know, and if you can memorize, even if you don't fully understand it yet, that there are two categories of these data types in Java. Okay, maybe I should put in Java. So we're going to memorize that there are primitive types, there are 8 of them, and then there are reference types. So the 8 primitives, which we're going to go over, 8 primitives in Java. There are the integer types, which are byte, short, int, and long. Then there are the real number types, which are float and double. And then there are kind of the extraneous types, the char and the boolean. So these are the 8 types, byte, short, int, long. So half of them are types of integers. And then 2 of them are for real numbers. And then 2 of them are the extraneous ones, the chars, to hold single character, and boolean holds a true or false value. So these are actually quite easy in a lot of ways to memorize, even what size they are. So, for example, we have byte, which is 1 byte. That's the size. And every time you go over, as long as you can memorize them in this order, byte, short, int, long, you can know fairly easily how much memory they occupy once the variable is reserved. So byte is 1 byte, short is double that, int is double that, and then long is double that. So byte takes up 1 byte, so that's 1 byte. Short takes up 2 bytes. Int is double that, so it takes up 4 bytes. And then long takes up 8 bytes. For the real numbers, you just kind of have to memorize it that float takes up 4 bytes, and then double takes up 8. The characters in Java use Unicode. The 16-bit Unicode, so that's 2 bytes. And then Boolean, unfortunately, depends on the architecture and situation, so you don't really have to memorize that size. But the other ones you should probably start memorizing the sizes just to get a feel of how much memory you're occupying at any given time. Definitely memorize the names of the 8 primitives, because then you'll know whether you're dealing with a primitive or a reference type, which will help you along the line later. So back to our discussion here with our friend the integer here, and this is pretty much the same for any of these. An integer, as you might know, any of these integer types is basically just a whole number. It's a number that does not have a decimal part. It can be negative, it can be positive, but it does not contain any kind of decimal. So the integer could be 3 or 5 or negative 70, but you wouldn't try to hold a value of 3.14. That would not fit in an integer. So we've got myInt here. We've declared it. Okay, so we've declared myInt as an integer, right? Okay, and of course these things that I'm putting double forward slashes are comments. They're ignored by the compiler, and I'm just making notes for myself and for you. So we've got int myInt, And then if I want to actually give it a value after I first declare it, I can say my int equals, we'll say 15. That's called initializing the variable. Okay, so anytime that you do it, it's in general called an assignment operation. Okay, but the first time you perform an assignment operation, it's called initialization because that's the initial time it gets a value. Now, this right here, my int, is the variable's name or the variable's identifier. The 15 is called a literal. Okay, so 15 is called specifically an integer literal. Okay, my int is called an integer variable. Okay, and then the equal sign is called the assignment operator because it assigns a value to a variable or a constant. Okay, so just to do something very simple here, let's say I want to print this out. Well, NetBeans has kind of a nice little feature. I can just type SOUT and hit tab, and it will automatically fill in system.out.println. That's a default autocomplete option. But you can type it out yourself if you'd like to practice. So system has to be capitalized. Then you have .out. This is called the standard output object. And then you have println, which is a method. And then this method can take an argument. The argument we're going to print, or we're going to use here, will be a concatenation of a string. So I'll say my integer is. So I put in double quotes my integer is, and then a space at the end so this doesn't look so crammed. And then you put plus my int. In this case, the plus symbol is for concatenation, or basically combining strings. So even though this is an integer and this is a string, it knows that it can't do any kind of arithmetic here. So it knows that the string has to, that the integer has to be converted to a string automatically and then appended to this string right here. So if we run it right now, if I right-click the file and then go to Run File, I will get some output. If I give it just a second, and there we go. We have my integer is 15 down at the bottom. That's pretty much what we expect. Other little details that we might want to work with is if you're dealing with a variable, that is, I can actually change the value of the variable. So I can say my int equals 20, and then maybe I want to print it out again. My integer is now, okay. So if I run it this time, the first time it came across the print statement, we've got my integer is 15 because that was the value that the integer variable directly held. Now it says my integer is now 20. You can even perform different types of arithmetic as well. So if I want to say something like this, my int equals 5 times 2, I can do that. And then print out after multiplying, my int is. Okay, let's see what happens. So you've got my integer is 15, my integer is now 20, my int is 10. So we can perform multiplication. So that's another thing we'll talk about in other lectures is the arithmetic operators. But for now, we can see that multiplication is represented by the asterisk, which is Shift 8 on the standard US QWERTY keyboard. So that's pretty much what I've got for you right now. We'll talk about more of this stuff in detail as we go along. So thanks, and have a great time with your journey.